Subsequent investigations by Finnish prosecutors have come to the conclusion that the ship deliberately dropped its anchor and dragged it along a stretch of the Baltic seabed for about 90 or 100 kilometers, damaging 5 underwater cables in the process, including S-Link 2. And as a result, they are now prosecuting the captain of the ship, who's a Georgian national, and its first and second mates. And I believe this is the first time that any NATO country has brought such a prosecution linked to the Russian shadow fleet.
Oliver Moody, Berlin correspondent for The Times. Thanks for joining The World in 10. Now, before we focus on the specific case, may you just outline what exactly the so-called shadow fleet is and its purpose? Because this is primarily to do with oil and evading sanctions rather than sabotage.
It's a bit of a nebulous term that has come into common parlance to describe anything between 400 and 1,500 vessels, primarily oil tankers, often flagged to third-party countries such as Liberia or Gabon that don't enforce Western sanctions against Russia, that are primarily used by Russia to evade the G7 price cap on its oil exports, which are absolutely a pillar of its war economy and have only become more significant since Russian gas has struggled to find buyers.
And has this proved an effective method for evading sanctions for Moscow? Because we hear of tactics, things like emitting false GPS locations, ship-to-ship transfers at sea. I'm just wondering, how hard is it to police the fleet's movements when it comes to maritime law? And indeed, if there is a willingness and ability to do so?
Well, to put it into perspective, traditionally something like 40% of the Russian state's revenues have come from oil. That proportion has probably increased with the difficulty of selling Russian gas. And about half of that has gone through the Baltic Sea, these ports in the west, because Russia has a real shortage of reliably ice-free ports for exporting oil. And so this fleet is tremendously significant in terms of sustaining the Russian regime's ability to fund its war in Ukraine. And it is very, very difficult to police these ships, first of all, because it's not always clear what is and is not part of the shadow fleet. These ships are not only sailing under flags of convenience, usually from non-Russian countries, but they're also often owned by parties in third countries such as Greece or the United Arab Emirates or Turkey. Shipping, finance, and insurance are often very kind of complex multinational structures. A lot of these incidents, the kind of spoofing and the switched off transponders you alluded to, happen in international waters. So the NATO members are getting better at monitoring this traffic and identifying the suspect ships, and there is now a list of more than 100 that have been sanctioned by the EU and Britain and the US. But it remains very difficult, particularly in cases where it is suspected that these ships are being used by Russian intelligence either to carry out surveillance on sensitive offshore infrastructure, or indeed to sabotage that infrastructure.
Well, on that note, looking at the case of Eagle S now, so this was a foreign flag vessel. It was sailing through the Baltic Sea on Christmas Day when this key power cable between Finland and Estonia suddenly goes down. So what do we know about the ship? Where was it heading? What was it carrying? And how may it be linked to this cutting of the S-Link 2 power cable?
So the Eagle S was flagged to the Cook Islands and appears to have been owned by a company based in the United Arab Emirates. It had loaded a cargo of unleaded petrol in the Russian port of Ust-Luga, which is near St. Petersburg, and appears to have been bound to a destination in the Middle East, possibly in Egypt, possibly in Turkey. And on the morning of Christmas Day, last year. It was detected in the vicinity when there was an abrupt outage on the S-Link 2 power cable that goes under the Gulf of Finland between Finland and Estonia. And that outage knocked out something like 2/3 of the electrical interconnector capacity between the two countries. So a pretty substantial blow, even though there was some redundancy, and it was pretty quickly repaired. It's estimated to have done about 60 million euros worth of damage. And what is striking about this case and important about it is that the Finnish authorities acted very quickly in identifying the Eagle S as a suspect vessel within a matter of a few hours, and not only deployed a Coast Guard vessel to escort it towards Finnish territorial waters, but then also sent in armed police and a special border guard unit to board the ship. So it was impounded, and the crew were prevented from leaving. And subsequent investigations by Finnish prosecutors have come to the conclusion that the ship deliberately dropped its anchor and dragged it along a stretch of the Baltic seabed for about 90 or 100 kilometers, damaging 5 underwater cables in the process, including S-Link 2. And as a result, they are now prosecuting the captain of the ship, who's a Georgian national, and its first and second mates. And I believe this is the first time that any NATO country has brought such a prosecution linked to the Russian shadow fleet.
And from what I understand, in the past, these accusations have been quite hard to prove because of the measures and ambiguity that you've outlined already. Will the Finnish authorities be looking at this as an independent criminal case focusing solely on this one ship and its crew? Or can we expect an effort to link this back to Moscow and a wider strategy to sabotage undersea infrastructure?
I mean, both are true. So as a criminal prosecution, it will inevitably deal with the facts of the case, and one central question will be the extent to which it is possible to prove any role played by the Russian state, given that everyone involved is not Russian so far. But also, inevitably, this is part of a wider framework of action by particularly the kind of Northern European NATO members who have most to deal with the Shadow Fleet. And right now, beyond the sanctions, the conversation is moving on to things like challenging these ships to demonstrate their insurance. A lot of them are very poorly insured, very accident prone. There are concerns that some of them already have run adrift at sea, but that there could be a major oil spill leading to an environmental disaster. And so the idea is that if they cannot demonstrate that they are adequately insured, you would deny them access to NATO ports. And then the obvious elephant in the room is whether you start to try and close the shipping lanes to some of these vessels. But there is a great reluctance to do so because of the risk that that would invite retaliation against European vessels elsewhere in the world.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting how that then links into the current picture and the pressure from the United States in terms of, are we edging slowly closer towards some kind of ceasefire or agreement in Ukraine? There's obviously that key summit on Friday. Has there been any reaction from Moscow on this particular case? And if countries, NATO countries, continue to put the Kremlin in the spotlight over these types of cases, what are the possible implications for NATO and Russian relationships going forward?
I'm not aware that the Kremlin has issued any statement on this particular case, and in a way, to do so would be to concede that there is some plausible link that could be drawn between the Eagle S and the Russian authorities. But in terms of the kind of wider geopolitics of this, we are at a moment where Europe is trying to assert a greater level of independence from the US in terms of its policy towards Russia and Ukraine. The argument is that Europe now bears the overwhelming burden of financing aid, including arms shipments to Ukraine, that it has the leverage of those 200 or 300 billion euros worth of frozen Russian assets, and that it is rearming and therefore has a kind of greater claim to autonomy. And the conflict with the Shadow Fleet is a really crucial dimension of that assertiveness. And what we have seen lately in quite a striking development has been an increasing willingness on the part of the NATO members bordering the Baltic Sea, including Poland and Estonia, to send out vessels to confront ships from the Shadow Fleet. And correspondingly, we have seen that some of those vessels are now sailing under escort from the Russian Navy or Air Force. And so there was an incident where the Estonians tried to confront a suspected Shadow Fleet vessel near their waters, and there was a Russian military aircraft escorting the ship. So the potential for further escalation is certainly there.
And just returning to this power cable, if it, as you said, one ship possibly using its anchor could take out 60% or a large proportion of power in these countries, I mean that's a real source of vulnerability for that region. If one ship can achieve that without coming under armed protection from Russian military vessels.
It is, and it's very, very difficult to protect these undersea gas pipelines and electrical interconnectors and data cables, because often these incidents take place in international waters. The Baltic is a relatively shallow sea, but its kind of hydrographic structure in terms of the kind of salinity below a certain level makes it very difficult to keep a complete overview of what's going on at the bottom of the sea. And the surveillance has improved significantly since the start of the year. NATO navies in the region have been mounting much more intense patrols under the Baltic Sentry program. There's more surveillance by drones and things like that. There are smart things you can do with remote sensors at either ends of the cables to detect these outages promptly and to locate where on the cable they might have happened. But ultimately, the best answer to the problem is redundancy. You want to have as many connections as possible so that the damage caused by any single incident of disruption is minimal. And there has been a lot of activity in that direction. And one thing that we've really noticed is that even allowing for the propensity of the authorities to play down the significance of these incidents, very often the disruption has been very temporary and limited. And so I think the kind of resilience of this infrastructure is improving all the time. And ultimately, that is the best insurance policy that the NATO countries in the region have got.
And finally, Oliver, I mean, is there a long-term objective of this grey zone or hybrid warfare, if you can class it as that? I'm thinking of examples of, whether it's Russian bombers being kind of intercepted by NATO jets or frigates having to be shadowed in the English Channel by the Royal Navy. Is this all part of just a constant probing of defences? Can we class it as mere disruption, or is Moscow potentially setting the groundwork should there be a future conflict in the Baltic states or Eastern Europe?
This is a very live and controversial debate in the Russia watching community. There are indeed many analysts who argue that a lot of this is largely mindless disruption for the sake of disruption and kind of keeping us on our toes and off balance and divided and using up attention and resources that could better be deployed elsewhere. And I think there are a lot of plausible arguments in favor of that, given that a lot of the activity may not necessarily be coordinated from the highest levels of the Russian security authorities. It could be a manifestation of what Mark Galeotti, the prominent Russia commentator, calls the kind of adhocracy that has flourished under Putin. However, there are also a number of very influential experts who argue, precisely as you said, that there could be a much darker and more systematic framework to this, and that what we are seeing is in fact the detailed mapping of NATO's vulnerabilities across the Baltic region, and potentially the kind of testing of our defences in preparation for some kind of military escalation. There is no consensus, as far as I'm aware, among experts on this subject. So I think we have to remain alive to both possibilities.